March 5th, 1936, Eastleigh Aerodrome, Southampton. On a grey, wind-cut morning, the prototype Supermarine Type 300 lifted off the runway for the first time. The aircraft was small, narrow-winged, and almost entirely untested. It carried a single Rolls-Royce Merlin C engine and the hopes of Britain's Air Ministry, which had spent the last 5 years struggling to modernise its fighter force. What would later be named the Spitfire was, at that moment, just another experimental interceptor. Light, under-armoured, and considered too complex for mass production. Early test reports were divided. Pilots praised its speed and manoeuvrability, but ground crews complained that its thin-skinned aluminium fuselage dented easily under maintenance tools. German observers, who had already fielded the all-metal Messerschmitt Bf 109, mocked the design in intelligence briefings, calling it a flying tin can. The phrase caught on among Luftwaffe crews, an insult suggesting fragility and poor durability. To them, the British fighter looked like a toy compared to the heavy, angular German machines being prepared for Europe's coming war. Inside Britain's Air Ministry, doubts mirrored those insults. The Spitfire's elliptical wings were difficult to manufacture. Its rivet pattern required precision tools, and production times were far slower than with the older Hawker Hurricane. Many senior officers believed it was an engineer's vanity project rather than a practical weapon. Yet designer R.J. Mitchell insisted that aerodynamic efficiency would outweigh all other factors. "Speed is armour," he told colleagues, a statement few in 1936 accepted. By 1938, with Europe sliding toward conflict, Britain ordered the first production run. The decision was strategic desperation more than confidence. Intelligence reports showed rapid German rearmament. The RAF needed numbers, even imperfect ones. Factories at Woolston and Castle Bromwich were retooled to build the new fighter, though output lagged behind expectations. Only a few squadrons had the aircraft when war broke out in September 1939. Initial combat over France in 1940 did little to change opinions. Luftwaffe pilots encountered the Spitfire rarely, and when they did, reports described it as light and undergunned. Armour protection around the fuel tank and cockpit was minimal. A single cannon burst could cripple it. The flying tin can label persisted, used in German briefings and propaganda as evidence that British aircraft construction lagged behind the Reich's advanced designs. But by May 1940, that perception began to erode. In the hands of experienced RAF pilots, the Spitfire displayed handling characteristics that no German engineer had anticipated. Its elliptical wings produced less drag at high speed, allowing rapid climbs and sustained turns without stalling. Against the Bf 109E, it could match altitude and outturn it in level flight. Technical reports from Luftwaffe combat evaluations began to note unexpected performance in diving recovery and instability as a target in close pursuit. The aircraft that had been dismissed as fragile was proving elusive. When France fell and Britain faced invasion, the Spitfire was thrust into the centre of defence planning. Fighter Command organised its squadrons around a new interception doctrine, using radar guidance to vector Spitfires toward bomber formations before they reached inland targets. The aircraft's speed and climb rate made it ideal for quick response missions. Still, production remained a major concern. Each Spitfire required nearly 13,000 individual man-hours to assemble, almost twice that of a Hurricane. Critics argued that resources should focus on simpler designs. Inside Supermarine's factories, engineers worked under blackout conditions, repairing airframes hit during raids and adjusting wing panels to improve structural strength. Pilots returning from sorties reported fuel leaks, jammed undercarriages, and thin canopy glass that shattered under minimal impact. Yet despite these flaws, morale in the squadrons remained high. The Spitfire handled like no other aircraft in the RAF's inventory, and its pilots trusted its agility more than they feared its vulnerability. By the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain began, the Luftwaffe's dismissive tone shifted. Intelligence officers replaced the term flying tin can with a more cautious note, the enemy fighter of elliptical wing planform. Pilots who had once laughed at its light frame now described it as turning inside us before we can react. Combat data showed that in head-to-head engagements, the Spitfire's kill ratio approached parity with the Bf-10-9, an outcome the Germans had not expected from an aircraft they considered mechanically fragile. What changed wasn't the structure of the plane, but the understanding of what made it dangerous. The same thin skin that dented under a mechanic's wrench also reduced drag. The light frame that couldn't take a cannon hit allowed the aircraft to climb faster than most opponents. In technical terms, its weaknesses were inseparable from its strengths. Mitchell's principle, that speed was armour, was being proven daily over southern England. As the Battle of Britain intensified, German propaganda quietly dropped the flying tin can phrase altogether. Internal Luftwaffe reports stopped mocking and started measuring. The Spitfire had become a primary threat to German bomber operations. It was no longer a curiosity, it was a problem, and it was only the beginning. August 13th, 1940. The Luftwaffe called it Adlertag, Eagle Day. It was the start of Germany's full-scale air offensive against Britain. Nearly 1,500 aircraft were sent across the Channel in coordinated waves aimed at crippling the RAF's airfields and radar stations. For the first time, the Spitfire would face the Luftwaffe not as an experiment, but as Britain's last defence. At 10:30 a.m., radar stations along the southern coast picked up incoming formations. The order went out from Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory. Squadron scramble. Within minutes, Spitfires from 11 Group roared into the sky from airfields like Biggin Hill and Hornchurch. Many pilots were barely out of training. They had fewer than 20 flight hours in the Spitfire, but they were about to fight one of the most advanced air forces in the world. German pilots still underestimated the aircraft they faced. Most believed they were encountering hurricanes, which were slower and less agile. But once in combat, that assumption quickly collapsed. The Spitfire's climb rate and acceleration caught the Luftwaffe off guard. Reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 described enemy aircraft that rise from below at alarming speed, turning inside our fighters at steep angles. The so-called flying tin can was outpacing and outmaneuvering Germany's top interceptor. The design, once mocked for its fragility, was showing what aerodynamic efficiency could do under pressure. In short bursts of combat lasting less than 2 minutes, the Spitfire's thin skin and lightweight frame made the difference between survival and being hit. It could roll faster, recover from dives sooner, and pull sharper turns without losing control. German pilots began to adapt their tactics, using altitude advantage to strike first and disengage before dogfighting. But the RAF's radar system often negated that edge, allowing Spitfires to intercept before the Germans even reached their bombing targets. By late August, Luftwaffe Command realized they were dealing with a far more dangerous opponent than expected. Technical sections requested captured wrecks for analysis. What they found contradicted nearly every assumption made since 1936. The fuselage, though light, was structurally sound. The wings, though thin, distributed lift evenly across the span. Even the rivet patterns, once criticised as inefficient, were calculated for maximum airflow. It wasn't a weak design. It was a precision weapon built on the edge of Britain's industrial capability. In combat, the numbers began to tell the story. Between mid-August and mid-September, RAF Fighter Command lost 388 aircraft, but Luftwaffe losses were over 600. Nearly half of those German aircraft were claimed by Spitfire squadrons. At high altitudes, where the Bf-109's engine performance began to drop, the Spitfire's Merlin power plant held steady. The aircraft's handling remained stable even at near-stall speeds, giving pilots critical control during steep climbs and dives. Despite those advantages, not everyone in Britain was convinced. Production bottlenecks, spare parts shortages, and training accidents plagued the squadrons. Some airfields had to cannibalize damaged Spitfires for usable components. A single missing radiator or propeller assembly could ground an entire aircraft. But on the front line, the pilots didn't care. To them, the Spitfire was not fragile. It was responsive. It reacted instantly, turning their control input into movement faster than any other plane in the sky. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, the tone of intelligence reports had changed completely. One assessment from late August 1940 noted, "The English have developed a fighter with unusual climbing performance and turning capability. Engagements must be limited to short bursts and height advantage maintained at all times." In other words, avoid dogfights with Spitfires. The psychological effect on German pilots was significant. The same aircrews that had once laughed at the tin can were now warning newcomers to respect it. Many began overestimating its speed and armament, breaking off attacks prematurely. Meanwhile, British pilots were learning how to exploit the enemy's caution. RAF instructors emphasized the Spitfire's turning ability, keeping engagements tight and forcing German fighters into sustained turns they couldn't win. Through the late summer, the skies over southern England became a test ground for every principle of modern air warfare: energy retention, turning radius, climb rate, and dive recovery. The Spitfire excelled in each category that mattered in a defensive battle. It couldn't take many hits, but it didn't need to. The plane that was once ridiculed for being too light was surviving because it didn't have to absorb damage. It simply avoided it. By September 1940, the Luftwaffe's losses became unsustainable. Bombers struggled to reach their targets without heavy escort. German leadership began to shift focus from airfields to civilian cities, starting the Blitz. The goal was to break British morale, not the RAF's infrastructure, but strategically, that shift marked an admission of failure. They hadn't destroyed fighter command. They hadn't destroyed the flying tin can. On the ground, British aircraft fitters and engineers worked around the clock under constant bombing to keep squadrons operational. Many of them recalled that the Spitfire, for all its elegance in the air, was a nightmare to repair. Its elliptical wings required custom-fitted panels. Its engine demanded precise tuning. But even with limited resources, they kept them flying. Pilots rotated between airfields, sleeping in dispersal huts beside their aircraft, knowing that each dawn could bring another raid. When the official battle records for September 15th were compiled, the day now known as Battle of Britain Day, the statistics told the full story. Of 56 German aircraft destroyed that day, nearly half were credited to Spitfire squadrons. The machine that the Germans once mocked had become the single most feared symbol of RAF resistance. The Luftwaffe's intelligence branch quietly retired the flying tin can designation. In its place, a new code name appeared in reports: Der elliptische Gegner, the elliptical opponent. The change in language said it all. What had begun as an insult had turned into acknowledgement. But the Spitfire's evolution didn't end with the Battle of Britain. The same design that saved Britain in 1940 would keep adapting: new engines, new wings, new armament, turning the once ridiculed prototype into one of the most versatile fighters of the entire war. And soon it would take the fight far beyond British skies. By early 1941, the Spitfire was no longer a symbol of desperation. It was a weapon of strategy. The defensive battles over southern England had ended, but the war in the air was changing. The RAF, no longer confined to its own skies, began to take the fight outward, to the French coast, the Low Countries, and the Channel approaches. The aircraft that had once scrambled to stop bombers was now escorting its own. For the first time, British fighter sweeps, codenamed rhubarbs and circuses, crossed into occupied Europe. The goal was twofold: to keep pressure on German defences and to draw out the Luftwaffe for engagement on British terms. The Spitfire, once mocked as a fragile toy, was now deliberately baiting the enemy. These early offensive missions exposed the aircraft to a new challenge. Over France, the Luftwaffe's Bf-109F, an improved model, began appearing in numbers. It was faster, climbed higher, and featured a more refined engine supercharger. On paper, it outperformed the Spitfire Mark I and Mark II in several metrics. German intelligence reports once again described British fighters as inferior at altitude. For a moment, it looked as though the balance was shifting. But Supermarine's design team, still operating under wartime secrecy, had already begun working on an upgrade. The Spitfire Mark V introduced the Merlin 45 engine, a new three-bladed propeller, and reinforced wing mounts that allowed heavier armament. By mid-1941, the improved model was in service. The results were immediate. Luftwaffe combat groups over France began reporting increased losses in engagements with the new Spitfire variant. The fragile-looking tin can was back, and this time it could strike. For ground crews, the Spitfire Mark V brought its own problems. The more powerful engine demanded tighter tolerances. Fuel leaks, spark plug fouling, and overheating were constant issues. But the pilots didn't care about maintenance headaches. What mattered was that the Spitfire could now hold its own against the 109 again, and often win. The aircraft's handling remained its greatest advantage. German pilots, trained to rely on power dives and altitude superiority, found themselves dragged into turning battles they couldn't escape. Throughout 1941 and 1942, the Spitfire's operational range expanded as RAF strategy evolved. Squadrons began operating from forward bases in southern England, supporting bomber raids across the Channel. Pilots flew long sorties over northern France, where engagements often lasted only minutes, but could determine control of the air for hours. For the first time since 1940, the Luftwaffe was being forced to defend. At the same time, new theatres demanded new modifications. In North Africa, Spitfires began arriving to support British and Commonwealth forces against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The desert environment was brutal: sand-clogged carburetors, engines overheated, and paint peeled from the wings. But the Spitfire adapted quickly. Field engineers fitted special air filters, repainted surfaces in desert camouflage, and replaced fragile components with improvised local parts. Against German and Italian fighters, particularly the Bf-109F and Machi C-202, the Spitfire once again proved its edge. Pilots from the Desert Air Force described the aircraft as forgiving yet lethal. Even with sandblasted wings and improvised filters, the Spitfire maintained tight handling and accurate gunnery at low altitude. Luftwaffe pilots operating in North Africa soon realized that any aircraft sighted with elliptical wings meant trouble. The tin can had followed them to the desert and was beating them there too. By 1943, the Spitfire had undergone another leap in performance. The introduction of the Mark IX, powered by the new Merlin 61 engine with a two-stage supercharger, closed the gap with Germany's newest fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190. When the FW-190 first appeared in late 1941, it had shocked RAF command. Early Spitfire models were suddenly outclassed in speed, climb, and armament. British losses rose, and morale took a hit. But the response came quickly. The Mark IX restored the balance. It could reach higher altitudes, accelerate faster, and match the FW-190 blow for blow. In many engagements, it came down to pilot skill, not machine capability. The Luftwaffe, which had once held the technological advantage, now faced an enemy that could adapt as quickly as they could innovate. Production, too, had evolved. The once fragile manufacturing process that critics had doubted in 1936 had been transformed into one of Britain's most efficient wartime assembly systems. Dozens of subcontractors, from furniture makers to car factories, were now producing Spitfire components. The weak metal toy was being built faster than ever before, and with every batch came minor improvements: better armor plating, improved radios, more reliable cooling systems. On the front lines, Pilots began to trust the Spitfire not just as a fighter, but as a survival machine. It could take damage and still bring its pilot home. One squadron record from 1943 noted that of 10 Spitfires hit by enemy fire over France, 7 made it back across the Channel. The tin can had quietly become durable. German intelligence analysts were well aware of this transformation. Luftwaffe technical officers at Merlin, Germany's main aircraft testing center, examined captured Spitfires and noted with irritation how each new variant closed previous performance gaps. One report, dated June 1943, remarked, "The English fighter continues to evolve in small increments, yet consistently achieves parity with our latest models. Its basic design, though lightweight, allows significant modification without loss of balance." It was an admission that the Spitfire's supposed weakness, its simplicity and light frame, was the very reason it could keep improving. By mid-1943, the Spitfire was serving in every major Allied theatre, from the beaches of North Africa to the skies over Sicily and the North Sea. Its role had shifted from defender to aggressor, from survival to superiority. German pilots no longer underestimated it. Many Luftwaffe veterans who had survived since 1940 began referring to it simply as der Gegner, the opponent. No insult, no mockery, just recognition. What the Luftwaffe had once dismissed as a flying tin can had forced them to re-evaluate their entire air combat doctrine. They had learned that raw power and heavy armor didn't always win in the air. Agility, response, and adaptability did. The Spitfire embodied those traits completely. And while new technologies were emerging, jets, rockets, and radar-guided systems, the elliptical winged fighter that had once been considered impractical was still proving relevant. The aircraft that had been laughed at in design meetings, doubted in factories, and ridiculed by enemy pilots was now dictating the terms of the air war, and the Germans knew it. By 1944, the Spitfire had become more than an aircraft. It was a standard. Every new Allied design was compared to it. Every Luftwaffe improvement tested against it. What had begun as Britain's desperate defensive tool had now evolved into a global instrument of Allied air power. The Mark 9 remained the backbone of many squadrons, but new variants, like the Mark 14, fitted with the Griffon engine, were entering service. They were faster, heavier, and deadlier. Yet despite those changes, the aircraft's essence stayed the same thin, elliptical wings, the same light frame that German engineers once mocked as a racer's toy. By 1944, the Spitfire had become more than an aircraft. It was a standard. Every new Allied design was compared to it. Every Luftwaffe improvement tested against it. What had begun as Britain's desperate defensive tool had now evolved into a global instrument of Allied air power. The Mark 9 remained the backbone of many squadrons, but new variants, like the Mark 14, fitted with the Griffon engine, were entering service. They were faster, heavier, and deadlier. Yet despite those changes, the aircraft's essence stayed the same. The same thin elliptical wings, the same light frame that German engineers once mocked as a racer's toy. In the European theatre, the Spitfire's role continued to expand beyond dogfights. It became a reconnaissance platform, a fighter bomber, and an escort for Allied bombers pushing deep into occupied Europe. The aircraft's design allowed for rapid adaptation. Remove a gun bay, fit a camera. Swap out the standard Merlin for a pressurized engine, and it could climb above 40,000 feet. German radar often couldn't even track it at those altitudes. What had once been a fragile defensive fighter was now one of the most versatile tools in the war. When Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion, the Spitfire was already entrenched in every part of the operation. It mapped beaches, photographed coastal defences, and intercepted German reconnaissance aircraft trying to do the same. On D-Day itself, Spitfire squadrons flew constant cover over the landing zones, tracking enemy fighters, strafing ground positions, and ensuring air superiority during the most critical hours of the campaign. For the pilots who flew those missions, the aircraft had evolved far beyond its 1940 origins. The Spitfire was no longer the symbol of survival. It was the instrument of control. On the German side, the respect, once reluctant, had become institutional. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from 1944 routinely identified the Spitfire as the most balanced Allied fighter in service. The Focke-Wulf 190 still held advantages in certain areas, but German pilots knew that underestimating the Spitfire meant dying quickly. Engagement tactics shifted yet again. Luftwaffe leaders instructed their units to avoid one-on-one turning fights. Dive attacks, slashing passes, and group ambushes became standard. The Spitfire's agility could not be matched, so German doctrine adapted around avoiding its strengths entirely. But even that adaptation didn't save them. The Spitfire's latest versions, especially the Griffin-powered Mark 14, erased much of the German advantage in speed and climb. Pilots described the new model as violent in its acceleration. It could reach 440 miles per hour, climb at nearly 5,000 feet per minute, and hit with devastating accuracy. The plane, once ridiculed for being too light to survive, now tore apart German formations before they could even regroup. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Spitfires followed the Allied ground advance relentlessly. They strafed retreating convoys, cut rail lines, and destroyed bridges. The aircraft's compact size and responsiveness made it perfect for low-level attack missions. Many pilots compared it to driving a sports car through a battlefield. Every control input mattered. Every movement was direct. Yet even as it became a tool of destruction, the aircraft retained its original philosophy: efficiency over brute force. The same aerodynamic principles that made it slippery and quick in 1940 now made it fuel-efficient and flexible in 1944. In an era where the war was defined by heavy bombers and massive engines, the Spitfire remained lean, simple, and effective. That efficiency was what allowed it to keep evolving. When Allied bombers began targeting Germany itself, the Spitfire often served as high-altitude escort. It couldn't match the range of American P-51 Mustangs, but it filled critical gaps, covering withdrawal routes, protecting stragglers, and engaging interceptors before they reached the bomber formations. In those roles, the Spitfire's agility was a lifesaver. American bomber crews often recalled seeing small groups of elliptical winged fighters weaving through flak and contrails, intercepting German attackers with surgical precision. As 1945 approached, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Its veteran pilots were gone, its fuel reserves nearly empty, its airfields cratered and scattered. Yet even in the final months, German air units continued to fear Spitfires as much as they had 5 years earlier. Reports from the final days of the war noted that many German pilots would break off engagements at the mere sight of a Spitfire's silhouette. It wasn't superstition, it was experience. The aircraft's record spoke for itself. Across Europe, the Spitfire's adaptability made it indispensable. It escorted supply planes into the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. It patrolled over the Rhine during the Allied push into Germany. It even intercepted the new German jet fighters, the Me-262s, aircraft that were faster but often vulnerable during takeoff and landing. In several confirmed cases, Spitfire pilots caught and destroyed jets before they could climb out of reach. It was a symbolic victory, the light, propeller-driven toy from 1936 shooting down the most advanced weapon of the Third Reich. By the end of the war, more than 20,000 Spitfires had been built in over 24 variants. It was no longer just a machine, it was a concept that had survived constant adaptation. The Germans had called it a weak metal toy, but its frame had outlasted the Reich itself. The same aircraft design that once defended a single island had helped liberate an entire continent. Even after the war ended, the Spitfire refused to fade away. It continued flying in dozens of air forces worldwide, repainted, rearmed, and repurposed. Some became trainers, others reconnaissance aircraft, some even post-war interceptors. The plane that began as a fragile experiment became one of the longest-serving fighters in aviation history. And for the pilots who flew it, the memory never faded. They remembered how it handled, how it responded instantly, how it seemed to think with them in combat. They remembered the early days when it was laughed at, when engineers were told it would never survive a war, when German officers dismissed it as a curiosity. The same lightweight frame they mocked carried Britain through its darkest hours, survived desert heat, faced the best of the Luftwaffe, and still flew over Berlin at the end of the war. The flying tin can had outlived its insult. It became the one thing its enemies never expected, a legend built not on strength, but on precision. After 1945, the Spitfire entered a new phase of its life, one defined not by survival, but by legacy. The war that had forged it was over, but the world it had helped shape was entering a new kind of conflict. The same qualities that made the Spitfire deadly in combat, its adaptability, reliability, and simplicity, now made it invaluable in rebuilding air forces around the world. Nations devastated by war needed aircraft fast, and the Spitfire was ready. It was cheap to maintain, easy to modify, and available in large numbers. Within months of the war's end, Spitfires bearing new markings began appearing across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. In Britain, the RAF continued to rely on it as jet technology developed. The first generation of British jets, the Gloucester Meteor and the de Havilland Vampire, were experimental and temperamental. They burned fuel quickly, had limited range, and demanded extensive maintenance. The Spitfire, by contrast, was proven and dependable. For hundreds of pilots, it became the bridge between two eras, the final piston-driven ace and the beginning of the jet age. It also became a political symbol. In newly independent nations, receiving Spitfires from Britain wasn't just about acquiring an aircraft. It was about prestige. It represented victory, modernity, and air power. In Czechoslovakia, surplus Mk9s were refitted and flown under new roundels. In Denmark, Norway, and Belgium, they formed the backbone of post-war air defense. Even in countries far from Europe, the elliptical winged fighter found new life. India, Israel, Egypt, Burma, and Thailand all flew Spitfires in the years following the war. But peace didn't last long. In 1948, the aircraft once built to defend Britain found itself fighting again, this time in a completely different context. The Arab-Israeli War saw Spitfires on both sides of the conflict. Egyptian squadrons flew them against Israeli forces, which had secretly acquired several Czechoslovak-built versions. The result was one of the strangest air battles in history, Spitfire against Spitfire, flown by pilots from opposite sides of a new geopolitical divide. For many observers, it was proof of how far the design had spread and how long it could endure. The Spitfire's structure, originally mocked for being too fragile to handle rough field conditions, continued to prove its worth. Its modular layout allowed quick repairs, even in desert airstrips and makeshift hangars. Mechanics could strip and replace parts using basic tools, and the aircraft's design tolerated field improvisation. That reliability was why so many nations kept it in service into the 1950s, even after jets became standard. In Britain, the Spitfire also played a crucial role in the transition to jet operations. It trained generations of pilots in energy management, precision flying, and combat discipline. The RAF understood that before pilots could handle early jets, machines that demanded near-perfect control, they needed to master something that punished carelessness. The Spitfire was ideal for that. Its flight characteristics demanded respect. Pull too hard in a climb and you stalled. Mishandle the rudder and you spun. But if you understood it, it became an extension of thought. For many, the Spitfire was their first real teacher in the air. Its reconnaissance versions, meanwhile, continued serving long after the last dogfights ended. The unarmed PR photo reconnaissance variants, painted in pale blue or pink camouflage for sky blending, carried cameras instead of guns. These aircraft mapped the post-war world, photographing cities, coastlines, and infrastructure across Europe and the Middle East. In an ironic twist, the same aircraft once used to locate German targets was now helping rebuild what the war had destroyed. Technically, the aircraft kept evolving as well. Later versions introduced pressurized cockpits, bubble canopies for improved visibility, and even clipped wings for higher roll rates at low altitudes. Some were equipped with Griffon 65 engines producing over 2,000 horsepower, giving them performance on par with early jets at certain altitudes. Engineers who had once struggled to keep the airframe light enough for the Merlin engine now found themselves reinforcing it to handle all that extra power. The same weak frame the Germans mocked had proven capable of handling nearly double its original output without losing stability. By the early 1950s, jet fighters had replaced the Spitfire in most frontline roles. But even then, it didn't disappear. Instead, it took on new duties in secondary roles: air policing, coastal patrol, and ceremonial flight. The RAF's Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, established in 1957, kept several Spitfires operational to preserve their legacy. Those aircraft, restored and maintained with precision, became flying reminders of what had once been at stake. Outside Britain, the Spitfire continued to see combat in small regional wars and border skirmishes well into the 1950s. In Burma, they fought in jungle environments. In India and Pakistan, they patrolled contested borders. In Egypt, they clashed with Israeli aircraft once again, during brief air incidents in the early years of the Cold War. For an aircraft first flown before World War II, its service record was unprecedented. What made the Spitfire endure wasn't just its beauty or reputation, it was its engineering. The aircraft's combination of aerodynamic efficiency, manageable weight, and modular structure meant it could be modernized faster than most contemporaries. Designers built it on margins that allowed growth, engine swaps, new wings, new equipment, without needing to start over. It was a machine that could evolve, not just exist. In historical context, the Spitfire's survival marked a rare instance where a wartime design transcended its original purpose. It had begun as a product of necessity, Britain's response to a looming invasion. But it ended as a timeless example of functional design. In museums, hangars, and airfields across the world, it remains one of the few World War II aircraft still capable of flying in original form. Many modern restorations have proven just how resilient its structure was. Some recovered wrecks, pulled from crash sites decades later, were found with intact fuselage frames, bent but not broken. Even in modern military academies, the Spitfire's combat record is studied not for nostalgia, but for its lessons in adaptation. It proved that flexibility in design can outweigh brute force, that an aircraft's survival depends as much on its ability to evolve as it does on raw performance. And that underestimating something because it looks fragile can be the most dangerous mistake in war. When the last operational Spitfires were finally retired from military service in the 1960s, they left behind more than records and statistics. They left behind a standard for what a fighter aircraft could be, not the strongest, not the heaviest, but the most responsive. The weak metal toy that once struggled to earn respect ended up setting the benchmark for every fighter that followed. Even now, decades later, when one starts up at an air show and the Merlin engine roars to life, the sound carries more than nostalgia. It's the sound of an aircraft that defied every insult, every doubt, every assumption of fragility. It's the sound of precision that once changed the course of a war. And that is what the Germans never understood. They mocked it for being too light, too thin, too delicate. But that same fragility was what made it unstoppable. The Spitfire wasn't built to withstand punishment. It was built to avoid it. And because of that, it never stopped flying. The story of the Spitfire did not end with its retirement from frontline service. Its legacy extended far beyond the squadrons, airfields, and battle reports. By the 1960s, it had become a global symbol, not just of Britain's air power, but of what a fighter aircraft could accomplish when design, innovation, and strategy aligned perfectly. The weak metal toy had become an icon, and its influence shaped aviation long after the last Merlin engine shut down. In post-war Britain, the aircraft remained central to both training and morale. Fighter command's transition to jets was gradual, and for nearly a decade, Spitfires continued flying alongside early Meteors and Vampires. They served as advanced trainers, teaching new pilots how to manage energy, throttle response, and precise maneuvering. Every student who climbed into a Spitfire cockpit learned lessons that were not possible in more forgiving aircraft. Pull too steeply in a climb and the light frame punished you with a stall. Neglect rudder coordination and the plane spun almost instantly. These lessons, harsh as they were, prepared pilots for the rapidly changing era of supersonic flight. Even in an age of jets, instructors repeatedly emphasized that no simulator could replace the experience of flying a real Spitfire at altitude. Beyond Britain, the Spitfire's operational life extended in countries rebuilding their air forces. India, Pakistan, Burma, and Israel all received surplus aircraft. These nations used them in patrol, reconnaissance, and combat operations, sometimes against one another. The aircraft's durability, ease of maintenance, and ability to be flown from basic airstrips made it invaluable in regions with limited infrastructure. Field mechanics praised its modular construction. Wings could be swapped, engines could be overhauled, and minor combat damage repaired without complex tooling. The aircraft's original lightweight frame, once criticized, now proved essential. It allowed modifications that heavier aircraft could not accommodate without serious redesign. Israel's use of the Spitfire in the early 1950s illustrates its adaptability and lasting combat relevance. During the 1948 to 1949 Arab-Israeli War, Spitfires formed the backbone of the fledgling Israeli Air Force. Pilots often faced Egyptian and Syrian aircraft that were technologically similar, including other Spitfires and early Mustangs. Missions included air superiority patrols, ground attack, and reconnaissance. Despite being a propeller-driven aircraft in an era when early jets were emerging, the Spitfire's maneuverability allowed Israeli pilots to engage effectively, often gaining the upper hand. Combat reports from that period show engagements where the aircraft's superior turning radius and acceleration enabled it to dominate opponents with comparable firepower. In Europe, the Spitfire also played a less visible but significant role in mapping and monitoring during the Cold War. Reconnaissance variants, unarmed and fitted with advanced cameras, flew over borders, industrial regions, and contested airspace. In Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria, these aircraft mapped reconstruction efforts and potential military installations. The same aircraft that had once avoided German fighters now avoided radar detection, taking advantage of high-altitude performance and streamlined design. Its contribution to intelligence collection demonstrated that speed, agility, and reliability could remain relevant long after the era of dogfighting had ended. Technological evolution also continued in Britain and abroad. The last Spitfire variants received Griffon 65 and 66 engines, some producing over 2,000 horsepower, allowing them to approach 450 miles per hour in level flight. Bubble canopies and pressurized cockpits enhanced pilot comfort and visibility, while clipped wings improved roll rate for low-altitude combat. Aerodynamic refinements improved high-altitude stability and reduced drag. In practical terms, the airframe that German intelligence had once mocked for being too thin now supported nearly double the original engine power, heavier armament, and advanced avionics. Its design proved inherently scalable, a testament to Mitchell's foresight. Even outside military use, Spitfires became cultural and educational instruments. Airshows around the world featured them as flying demonstrations of mid-20th century aeronautical engineering. Restorers invested enormous effort into preserving the aircraft in airworthy condition. Decades-old examples, some recovered from crash sites or long-term storage, were repaired and flown again. The light structure, once considered a liability, allowed restorers to work on original components without extensive reproduction. Every flight was a reminder that the aircraft's initial design had been fundamentally sound. By the 1970s, the Spitfire had assumed a symbolic role in aviation history. It was no longer just an aircraft, it was a benchmark. Engineers studying fighter design examined its balance between lightness, power, and control. Historians used it to illustrate how adaptability could outperform raw performance in long-term operational effectiveness. Former pilots recounted its handling characteristics, the responsiveness of controls, and the instant feedback it gave for every input. Its lessons became case studies in military academies worldwide. Perhaps most striking was the aircraft's psychological impact. Even decades after the last combat sortie, the Spitfire retained an aura of respect. Pilots, engineers, and even aviation enthusiasts recognized the design for what it was, an aircraft that excelled because it forced precision, punished error, and rewarded skill. The Germans' original insult, weak metal toy, had evolved into an acknowledgement of ingenuity. It wasn't fragile, it was perfectly calibrated. It was survivable because it was efficient, agile, and relentlessly adaptable. By the end of the 20th century, the Spitfire had flown in hundreds of air forces, survived countless regional conflicts, trained generations of pilots, and inspired tens of thousands in museums and airfields. Its elliptical wings, thin fuselage, and responsive controls remained instantly recognizable. Scholars noted that very few fighter designs from World War II could claim such prolonged relevance. Jets had come and gone, supersonic aircraft had emerged, but the Spitfire had transitioned from a tool of war to a benchmark of aviation excellence. Even in the modern era, when one hears a Merlin engine start, the reaction is immediate. There is no mistaking the sound, the acceleration, or the precision with which the aircraft responds. Observers know that what they see in the air is more than a machine. It is history, engineering, and strategy combined in a single frame. Every roll, every climb, every dive demonstrates principles that German engineers failed to anticipate. Lightness paired with strength, fragility paired with resilience, simplicity paired with adaptability. Ultimately, the Spitfire's story is one of transformation. From a prototype doubted by engineers, ridiculed by enemies, and dismissed by the press, it became a symbol of victory, innovation, and enduring effectiveness. It survived the war, adapted to new technologies, served multiple nations in multiple conflicts, and set standards for generations of aircraft designers and pilots. Its frame, once called weak, became a testament to precision engineering. Its wings, once described as delicate, defined the shape of air combat for decades. Its engines, once underpowered in prototype form, became instruments of global reach and speed. And so, the weak metal toy that the Germans laughed at in 1936 became one of the most celebrated and influential aircraft in aviation history. It proved that the combination of careful design, adaptability, and practical engineering could outlast brute force, raw power, and assumptions of superiority. The Spitfire wasn't just a fighter, it was a standard. It wasn't built to withstand punishment, it was built to excel. It wasn't built to last forever, but in its ability to evolve, it did. The Germans never fully understood it. They mocked, underestimated, and misjudged its potential. Yet, decades later, every air show, every restoration, every pilot who climbs into a Spitfire cockpit carries the proof that what was once called fragile could not be stopped, could not be broken, and most importantly, could not be forgotten. The Spitfire had become immortal, not because it was indestructible, but because it was perfectly designed for what mattered most: control, precision, and survival. This is the full story of the Spitfire. The aircraft that began as a weak metal toy became a benchmark, a legend, and a standard that shaped air combat, aviation design, and history itself. And in every way that mattered, it never stopped flying.